A historic series of meetings took place in the past week at the Vatican with Indigenous leaders. Those culminated with Pope Francis apologizing for what he acknowledged were deplorable abuses suffered in Catholic-run residential schools in Canada. Charnel Anderson, who covers the Northwestern Ontario Hubs, spoke to members of the delegation, and she joins us now on that. Hi, Charnel.
Hi, Dan.
All right, so let's take a step back and talk about how did this trip actually come about?
So this trip has been in the works for a few years, but like a lot of things, it was put on hold because of the pandemic. So it was originally planned for December of last year, but the Omicron wave was surging at that time, so it was rescheduled for the end of March. However, the request for an apology from the Pope for the Catholic Church's role in residential schools goes back even further. In 2009, Phil Fontaine, who was then head of the AFN, he traveled to the Vatican with a small delegation at the request of Pope Benedict. And that's who they met with and who acknowledged the suffering of residential school survivors and expressed sorrow. But Pope Benedict didn't outright apologize. And so this call for an apology was later sort of enshrined in the Truth and Reconciliations Commission's calls to action in 2015. But it sort of languished for a while until 2017 when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau went to the Vatican to meet with Pope Francis. And at that time, he requested an apology. And Trudeau said that he seemed open to the idea, but again, it sort of fell by the wayside until last year, June 2021, shortly after hundreds of unmarked graves were discovered near the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, which was run by the Catholic Church for almost 80 years. And so that discovery led to renewed calls for the Catholic Church to release the documents they have related to residential schools. And it put more scrutiny on the fact that the church did not fulfill its promises to compensate residential school survivors under the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And it ultimately led the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops to start planning this trip in earnest, which finally happened last week.
All right, I want to talk about the delegation, more importantly, the person who led it. You spoke to Cassidy Caron, president of the Métis National Council. What was her reaction when she found out that she would lead the delegation to Vatican City?
So Cassidy is actually the first woman elected head of the Métis National Council. That happened last October. And very soon after that, she learned that she would be leading the Métis delegation to the Vatican. And at this point, again, the trip was scheduled for December, so she didn't have a lot of time to really get their delegation together and start planning for what they want to get out of this trip. But so she got the Métis National Council's board of directors together, and they decided kind of how they want to select their delegates. And they decided that the ultimate goal of this trip was really to elevate the voices of Métis residential school survivors.
You had mentioned, previous trips, of course, by Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I'm just curious, did she have any particular expectations with this trip going into it?
Yeah, so initially, the Métis National Council planned to go to Rome to invite the Pope to Canada to apologize on Indigenous land, which would fulfill the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action number 58, which I should point out was issued in 2015. And part of call to action number 58 was that it would be fulfilled within 1 year. It's been about 7 years. But in October, the Vatican announced that Pope Francis had agreed to come to Canada to meet with Indigenous leaders. So at that point, Cassie says that the Métis National Council shifted gears and decided that this trip would be about getting the Pope to listen to their stories, particularly the experiences of Métis residential school survivors. And so in preparing for this trip, Cassie told me that she met with a lot of survivors and elders in an effort to devise the best gift to give the Pope. And the survivors and the elders told her that the best gift, the greatest gift that they could bring was their stories and their truth. And so that kind of became the goal for this trip, to share those stories. So when Pope Francis does ultimately come to Canada, he has a greater awareness, a better understanding of the effects of the residential school system and intergenerational trauma.
All right, I want to show a photo of Cassidy Caron and the delegation here, which of course is made up of Métis First Nations and Inuit representatives. You can see the Pope is in the center, and then Cassidy is actually the fourth person to the right of the Pope. What did she have to say about her personal interactions with the Pope?
So Cassie really shared her experience from the perspective of observing the interactions between the Métis residential school survivors and the elders and the Pope. And the survivors and the elders shared their stories with the Pope, who I understand listened intently. And Cassidy said that the Pope really seemed struck by the stories that he was hearing. And so after they shared their stories, Cassidy delivered her message on behalf of the Métis National Council, which she described as inviting the Pope on a journey of truth, healing, reconciliation, and justice. And during this time, they also had the opportunity to share gifts with Pope Francis. And so the gifts they gave include a pair of red moccasins with traditional Métis beadwork, which were made by Mitch Case, who is one of the Métis delegates. And they also gave the Pope a Métis sash, which was made into a stole, which is what the Popes wear around their shoulders, which was a gift from the Métis Nation of Alberta. And then they also gave the Pope a book, which was full of stories from other Métis residential school survivors who couldn't attend. And along with the book was a letter, which kind of outlined actions that the Church and the Pope can take on this journey of truth, healing, reconciliation, and justice.
As you mentioned, of course, what came out of that was an apology in Vatican City. I want to pull up a clip that looks at that apology.
For the deplorable conduct of these members of the Catholic Church,
E vorrei dirvi di tutto cuore, sono molto addolorato. E mi unisco ai fratelli vescovi canadesi.
I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry, and I join my brothers, the Canadian bishops, in asking your pardon.
As you mentioned, this apology was a Truth and Reconciliation recommendation. What was the former chair of the TRC, Mary Sinclair's reaction to that clip?
So after the apology, Murray Sinclair, who, as you say, was a chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from 2009 to 2015, he spoke about the issue of those who deny the harms of the residential school system. As APTN reported, Murray said, quote, "Denialism was allowed to flourish because of the silence that was coming from the Pope. With this statement, those denying within the church or denying in public because of the church being able to support denialism will no longer have that ladder upon which they can stand." End quote. And so this is something that that was important to Cassidy as well. The Métis National Council are calling on the church to consider making it a crime within canon law to deny or diminish the malicious intent behind the abuse and trauma that occurred as a result of the residential school system. And, we saw some of this denialism even following reports of unmarked graves last year. Some people tried to deny the evidence that there are graves at these former schools. But now the Pope has acknowledged the harms of the residential school system. And as Marie said, those denying the harms will no longer have that ladder upon which they can stand.
I want to get Cassidy's take on that apology as well. She was there in person. Did it make a difference?
So Cassidy told me that it really wasn't about her or how she felt personally about the apology. What mattered to her was really the reaction from the residential school survivors that she was with as the apology was being read. And, so she was sitting in that room and she said that you could really feel and hear and see their reaction. She said that it changed their lives. But Cassidy also acknowledged that the Pope's words mean different things to different people, depending on where they're coming from and where they're at on their healing journey. From what I can tell, talking to other people and reading stories and comments online, the reception to the apology overall has really been mixed. There's people who feel that it's meaningless without concrete action. Some people say it's too little too late. And some people accept the apology but wished it would have happened on Indigenous land. But for other people, it really was a significant moment. This is the head of the Catholic Church acknowledging the harms perpetrated by some of its members. And I think for some people that acknowledgement may validate what they knew all along, but, it really allows them to move forward on their healing journey, possibly towards forgiveness and a less complicated relationship with the Catholic Church, with perhaps the caveat that these words are turned into action.
As you mentioned, Pope Francis making an apology on Indigenous lands is seen as the two-part in this apology and the most important part. He said he would travel to Canada. Is this seen by Indigenous people as a positive prospect?
So yeah, it sounds like the Pope is going to come to Canada, and it's not entirely clear when that will be. He said not in the winter time, but it could be sometime this summer. Some are saying even the end of July. During the Feast of St. Anne, which the church celebrates on July 26th. But that's yet to be confirmed by the Vatican. Regardless of when it happens, though, I think at that time, people will be looking for another apology on Indigenous land, for those who weren't able to make it to the Vatican. And that would fulfill the TRC's call to action number 58, an apology from the Pope in Canada. And I think that would be really meaningful for a lot of people. But, as I say, a lot of the details have yet to be confirmed. We don't know whether there will be another apology, but I do know that it's already a highly anticipated visit.
Charnel, really appreciated. Great insights. Thank you so much for this important story.
Thanks, Jan.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.